a given area, there are different plant and animal species inhabiting with different distributions and abundance. Now, we talk about what give rise to the patterns of their community structure. The expression of a species' ecological niche helps us understand the factors that influence the structures of community, and certain adaptations determine these species' fundamental niche. Survival of a species is the first factor for a species to be considered a component of an ecological community in a given location. Under different environmental conditions, each species must use their set of adaptations to be able to survive, grow, and reproduce. Various species' fundamental niche can be represented along the environmental gradient. This is a gradual change in the abiotic factors such as temperature, altitude, and depth. Species abundance usually change along the gradient with the response of each species. Although fundamental niches overlap, its distributions along the gradient poses a constraint on community structure because species distribution and abundance change as environmental conditions of different locations changes. This is what we call a null model. This assumes that in a given community, individual species presence and abundance are a result of the independent responses of each individual species to the abiotic environment. It also states that species interaction have no significant influence on structures of the community. However, there are evidences that states that the presence and abundance of species are indeed influenced by species interactions, and the resulting shift in the response of the species is what we call as their realized niche. After seeing how biological structure of a community is constrained by environmental tolerances or fundamental niche of species, as well as realized niche, let us now see how the presence and abundance of species change because of the differences among species in environmental tolerances, as well as the nature of the species interaction. We now call this as zonation. The best environment to observe patterns of zonation is a rocky intertidal environment. Because of the tidal cycle, the intertidal zone is subjected to changes in environmental conditions, and these result to the well-definition of the dominant species in the upper and lower limits because competitive ability, as well as tolerance to environmental stress, result to changes in distribution of species. For example, let's take a look at plant species. Variations in the light, water, and nutrient availability allow for a general pattern of trade-off between characteristics that enables a species to survive and grow under low resource ability, and those that grow under high resource ability, which allows for high rate of photosynthesis.
We have known in our previous lessons that most studies that focuses and explain the role of species interactions on community structures are usually focusing on the direct interaction between two, or at best, a small subset of the species found within a community. Little did we know that these studies most likely underestimate the significance of species interactions on the structure and dynamic of communities, because these interactions are mostly diffuse and it involve a number of species. According to Robert MacArthur, diffuse competition is the total competitive effects of a number of interspecific competitors. Now, if the abundance of species is influenced by only a single competitor, the removal of that certain species may cause to have a significant impact on the environmental gradient in terms of response of the species. In order to have a better understanding to this kind of interaction, the generalized food web illustrates the diffuse nature of interactions, wherein it depicted the direct links between predator and prey. Moreover, food web also implies the potential for competition among predators for shared prey resource, and it illustrates the diffuse nature of species interactions within this community. As mentioned earlier, food web illustrates the diffuse nature of species, but aside from that, food webs also illustrates the indirect interaction between species. When we say indirect interaction, this is when one species does not interact with the second species directly, but instead influences a direct species that does directly with the second. Like in the experiment of Robert Payne, wherein he compared the effects of removing starfish from some areas and from the undisturbed areas. This resulted to what we call the keystone predation, in which the predator enhanced one or more less competitive species by reducing the abundance of the more competitive species. Another type of indirect interaction is called apparent competition by Robert Holt, wherein two species that do not compete with each other for limited resources affect each other indirectly by affecting prey for the same predator. Moreover, some indirect interactions can either have negative consequences, wherein an increased rate of predation because of an increase in the abundance of species 1 will cause a subsequent decline in the number of species in species 2. As in apparent competition, or positive consequences, wherein one species benefits another indirectly through its interactions with others, reducing either competition or predation.
There is a hypothesis about the similarity of the food web and the house of cards. This means that removing just one species and the result would be a cascading effect on the rest of the community. Now, there are specific species that have a more dominant effect on the structure of a community. In order to fully understand the importance of species interaction in the structure of a community, the food web is simplified by grouping similar species together. This group can be based on what they eat, like the carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, and the primary producers. If the productivity level is based on the trophic level below them, this is what you call a bottom-up control. This is when the plant density can greatly affect the density of animals. However, when it is the opposite, or when the predator controls the population of the prey, this is a top-down control. As we all notice, environmental conditions of a certain area is different from one location to another. They have different temperature, humidity, species of animals within it, and how those species interact with each other. This shows that biological structure of an area will change as we move from landscape to landscape, meaning that these environmental conditions are not homogeneous. This, however, is not a bad thing. Since there are different conditions within an area, there are more chances of supporting more species and making that area more diverse.
A variety of studies have shown an inverse relationship between nutrient availability and plant diversity in communities. By reducing growth rates, low nutrient availability functions to reduce competitive displacement. As nutrient availability in terrestrial communities increases, competition shifts from below ground to above ground. The net result is an increase in competitive displacement and a reduction in plant species diversity as the faster growing, tall plant species dominate the light source. Unlike the pattern observed in terrestrial plant communities, fertilization results in an increase in the species richness of autotrophs in both freshwater and marine communities.